This is Global Tennessee, news, analysis, and commentary from the Tennessee World Affairs Council in Nashville. Global Tennessee is produced in association with the Center for International Business at Belmont University and the International Business Council of the Nashville Area Chamber of Commerce. The World Affairs Council is a nonpartisan, nonprofit educational association, and the views expressed on Global Tennessee are those of the participants.
Welcome to the May 19th edition of Global Engagement, our news review. I'm Patrick Ryan.
And I'm Colleen Ryan.
Today we're going to talk about the top 5 topics in the news from the past week. First, let me thank our guest host, Colleen, who is sitting in today for Ambassador Charles Bowers, who will be getting ready for our evening webinar on the future of American diplomacy. Make sure to sign up for that. That's going to be a great program. First, let me introduce Colleen. Colleen is a member of the Tennessee World Affairs Council President's Advisory Board. She's been a volunteer with the World Affairs Council since 2007, when the council was formed, and she is a Belmont University Law School student, having completed a Haslam Scholarship undergraduate at the University of Tennessee, where she majored in global studies and sociology. That was followed by a year in York, England as a Fulbright, studying post-war recovery studies, including fieldwork in Kosovo. And she followed that with a year in Beijing at Tsinghua University as a fellow in the Schwarzman Scholars Program, where she received a master's in global affairs. So we're very pleased to have Colleen with us today, filling in for Ambassador Bowers. Colleen, can you share our topics of the week?
Yeah. First of all, I'm just honored to be attempting to fill the big shoes that Ambassador Dick Bowers has on this show. And today we'll be looking into 5 news topics, starting with COVID news in the World Health Assembly, followed by China and updates on the Belt and Road, then global energy, cheap oil and its outlook, followed by Afghanistan, the peace deal and COVID, and then the International Criminal Court in America's crosshairs.
Well, it's an ambitious schedule. We have a lot to cover today. That's been a very busy news week. First in news, as is our custom here at the Global News Review, we have gotten into the review of COVID data, and this week we look at the world stats. The previous 2 weeks you can see to the left, and then the stats for today. Globally, 890,000 cases and 320,000 deaths reported globally. We've seen the United States remain at in the number 1 position in terms of total cases and total deaths worldwide. Russia directly behind us, but about a quarter of the cases. China, you can see that this week they were a +6 nationwide. And as Ambassador Bowers reminded us last week, we've got to be very cautious in the numbers that are being reported from some countries. So that's the rundown of COVID cases. And we're going to talk a little bit about the news overnight from the World Health Organization. You may have seen in your news this morning that President Trump issued an ultimatum to the World Health Organization in a letter that he posted in a tweet. He said, "It is clear that the repeated missteps by you and your organization in responding to the pandemic have been extremely costly for the world. The only way forward is for the World Health Organization is if it can actually demonstrate independence from China." He said that the U.S. would reconsider membership if the WHO would not consider membership if the WHO did not commit to major substantive improvements within the next 30 days. You may recall that last month he suspended payments, the annual $400 million contribution of the United States to the World Health Organization for a period of 60 days. He didn't specify in the letter what the changes were being demanded, but he said that the WHO would be that the U.S. government would be in consultation with the WHO, and that the WHO response to his letter was that they were considering the contents and would talk with United States representatives. In response to that news about the ultimatum from the United States, China responded by saying that the U.S. was using China as an excuse to shirk its financial responsibilities that had been jointly determined by WHO member states. The foreign ministry spokesman said, quote, "The unilateral U.S. move to stop funding is a violation of its own international obligations," and that China was still in a critical juncture in support of the WHO's upholding multilateralism and its support of international anti-pandemic cooperation. So this is just the latest move on the part of the United States and China in response that raises concerns about influence on the international stage and the bickering between Beijing and Washington. Just so you know, the U.S. gives $400 million a year to the WHO, and in response to the current WHO flap, China's pledged an additional $30 million, which is about 1/3 above its biennial donation. And in related news, this week, the World Health Assembly, which is the governing body, the decision-making body of the WHO, met for 2 days in a virtual conference. And of note, Xi Jinping of China addressed the meeting. On the U.S. side, HHS Secretary Alex Azar talked to the group. There are some who probably would have liked to have seen President Trump address the WHO about our concerns, but Secretary Azar represented him. And he said that, quote, we must be frank about one of the primary reasons the outbreak, the COVID-19 outbreak, spun out of control, that there was a failure by this organization, the WHO, to obtain the information that the world needed, and the failure cost many lives. The WHO states have agreed to set up an independent inquiry into the global response to the coronavirus pandemic. That was approved in a resolution at the meeting of the World Health Assembly, with the EU coordinating a resolution among 100 nations. So the resolution in the end calls for an impartial, independent, and comprehensive evaluation of the international response. It's looking at the WHO's timelines pertaining to the COVID-19 pandemic and the functioning of the WHO itself. The U.S. was not entirely satisfied with how much the review was going to address some of the issues it has, but we'll look for further reporting on that. Just a recommendation, if you want to learn more about the World Health Assembly and what's been happening with the United States, China, and the WHO, the BBC World News has very solid reporting on what's happening there. The Chinese state media finished off the 2-day meeting of the WHA with a message from President Xi Jinping that, quote, "China is sincere, China is responsible, and China is contributing." So, you know, the back and forth between China and the United States continues. So we'll look for more on what's happening there. Colleen, let's take topic 2, and we'll segue right into what else is going on in China.
Yeah, so while China continues to demonstrate its commitment to contributing, its most ambitious global engagement initiative to date is stagnating more than at any other point in its 7-year history. Many of you are probably familiar with the Belt and Road Initiative. It's a vast collection of development and infrastructure initiatives announced in 2013 by President Xi Jinping, intended to stretch from East Asia over to Europe. A vast network of highways, energy pipelines, railway infrastructure. As of January, China had already invested an estimated $200 billion on these efforts. And research by Morgan Stanley has predicted that China's overall expenses in the lifetime of the Belt and Road Initiative could reach $1.2 or $1.3 trillion by 2027. So in the midst of the ongoing pandemic, China faces some real challenges keeping the momentum moving on the BRI. As you probably recall, China's GDP declined by 6.8% in the first quarter of 2020 from the year prior, making it the first economic contraction that China has experienced in decades.
That's a pretty phenomenal drop in their GDP. It seemed like they were pushing 10% for 25 years.
Yeah, I mean, COVID is having an impact on economies across the board. And in a piece the New York Times reported, many of China's Belt and Road partners, countries from Pakistan and Kyrgyzstan, many with much weaker economies than China's historically, have been requesting that China restructure, delay, or even forgive payments on the tens of billions of dollars in loans that are coming due in 2020 related to Belt and Road Initiative infrastructure, which puts China in a bit between a rock and a hard place. Does Beijing oblige these requests, restructuring and forgiving when its own economy is really struggling and strained by coronavirus? Or should it demand repayment or take over assets in countries that are already struggling with underdeveloped healthcare infrastructure and high poverty levels? In addition to that, the BRI's progress is strained by the obvious changes to supply chains, by travel bans that are affecting migrant Chinese labor. But there are opportunities available for China to really seize on some of the current dynamics that have resulted from the ongoing pandemic. One such opportunity in particular, within the BRI, there are some non-physical infrastructure components, things like the digital Silk Road, that aim to enhance digital connectivity across the regions connected by the BRI, and in particular further China's place as a technological superpower. So these are dynamics that I think we'll continue to see as China adjusts its own domestic and foreign policy to the real strain that coronavirus has put on the global economy.
Now, Colleen, you spent a year in Beijing at Tsinghua University, and you did an internship at Carnegie Tsinghua. So I'd like to just get your impression on how you probably didn't talk to the average Chinese citizen, but the Chinese that you spoke to in your university studies at Tsinghua, and the time you spent at the Carnegie think tank there on campus. What was your impression on how people in China felt about all the international connections and expansion, how Chinese influence was moving about around the world?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of Chinese people really see China playing a critical role as sort of a global South power. A lot of the rhetoric around the Belt and Road Initiative and Chinese cooperation with global South countries is that China is better able to understand and cooperate with global South countries, having in its own recent history and in many ways still maintaining a status as a developing country without the same history of Western colonialism that sort of fragments a lot of Western relationships with global South countries. So my experience in China, at which point the Chinese economy was still doing quite well, a lot of Chinese feel that it's sort of a responsibility and part of what China needs to be focusing on to claim its place as a power alongside the United States is to be building these ties. Because the Belt and Road Initiative fundamentally is an extension of domestic policy within China. A lot of the priorities within the Belt and Road Initiative are developmental priorities within China itself and access to resources. And so opinions may be changing now that, again, the Chinese economy is starting to experience the strain that we all are at this point. But certainly, I think your average Chinese person, or certainly the Chinese students I was in classes with and researchers that I worked with, believe in China's ongoing multilateralism efforts and commitment to cooperation.
Can you comment a little bit on the countries that are receiving some of this infrastructure aid and economic support and investments? capital and so forth from China. I think you were telling me that the concept is called or characterized as a debt trap. Is that something you can comment on?
Yeah, so there have been, especially in the early periods of the Belt and Road Initiative, a number of more controversial instances of some investments made by Chinese companies not being fruitful for the countries that they were invested in. Notably, a port in Sri Lanka that after Sri Lanka could not pay on the investment that China had made, China had seized the port. And certainly there have been many instances where recipient countries have not fared as well as I think certainly their hopes were going into their relationship with the Belt and Road Initiative.
Right, and I'm sure that the impact of the COVID-19 around the world in these countries that are not well suited to deal with it, and it, any downturn in the economy can cripple their ability to repay those debts.
Definitely. So it'll be certainly interesting to see how Chinese policymakers and recipient policymakers move forward on Belt and Road plans as the pandemic continues for the foreseeable future.
Terrific. Well, let's move on to our next topic. We're going to be talking about energy today. For the past couple of weeks, the past couple of months, actually, we've been seeing dramatic drops in the energy cost, the global energy cost, specifically the crude oil industry. I think it was 2 weeks ago we saw that Brent crude was trading for a negative $40, and everybody was making jokes about how they were going to invest negative $40 into a couple of barrels of crude oil that they'd recoup later on when the price went up. We're going to run through some slides here provided by the Energy Information Agency, the EIA. They produce some dandy reports on world energy, United States energy, country by country, region by region, and the global output. And in the first slide here, and we've talked a little bit about the downturn in energy. You can see the world production of energy has dipped significantly in million barrels per day in the final quarter of 2019. It was riding at about 100 million barrels a day, and then hit a downturn in Q1 of this year. And that followed world consumption, which hit a low point of about 82 million barrels a day in Q2. Currently, the consumption of world powers, world consumers in the energy market. You can see the forecast is looking at bouncing back in Q3 and Q4, but a lot of people are hedging their bets because we really don't know what's going to be driving the global economy in months to come. We saw in Colleen's presentation how China had hit a 6.8% downturn in its GDP, and China being a major consumer of crude oil, especially from the Middle East, they're kind of a bellwether in what the economic forecast will mean to the world energy market. You can see here the annual change in world liquids fuels consumption by region. The United States in blue. We've basically seen a downturn in all the markets, non-OECD, and the OECD is the industrialized nations of the world. The breakout here includes the Middle East, India, and China. And you can see how everybody has been consuming much less in terms of million barrels per day. And the downturn is 8.1 million barrels per day in 2020, the forecast, including where we've been so far in 2020 and for the rest of the year. Their forecast is that we'll wind up with a net negative of 8 million barrels per day consumed, expected to bounce back by 7 million barrels a day in 2021. So that's something hopeful for the energy industry that it bounced back. But I still don't think you're going to see an annual or a daily rate climb significantly, because there's going to be an overproduction that follows suit as the OPEC and non-OPEC producers crank up their oil production to try to recoup their losses from 2020. Here's a breakout defining the difference between non-OPEC production and OPEC production. And it's significantly on the side of non-OPEC producers, but a lot of that is consumption by countries like the United States and Canada and other non-OPEC countries, some European producers that have oil production, and a lot of that is consumed domestically. The world liquids fuels consumption, again, you can see million barrels per day, the sharp decline in 2020 with a bounce back to expected norms in 2021. This is the OPEC countries' production capacity, and this is the way we look at the ability of the OPEC countries to increase production when the demand is high. And in 2020, the excess capacity of the OPEC countries is almost 5 million barrels per day, and it will probably be reduced below 4 million barrels per day in 2021. And before we totally dazzle you with slides and graphics, here's one last look at global production. And you can see the total world production for 2020 is 95.19 million barrels per day. This is oil that's coming out of the ground and other liquids, liquefied natural gas and so forth. So you can look here at total world production 95.19 and total world consumption 92.59. That takes into account some inventory that was on hand at the end of year. So the consumption is actually lagging behind production. And we'll talk a little bit about the United States, where we get our oil and where we fit into the process. And people say, well, the United States now produces enough oil, we don't need to be concerned about Persian Gulf oil or oil from the North Sea or oil from Venezuela or other places. But in fact, a lot of the oil we get, we need to import different qualities of oil. So we are still an importer of some oils. But you can see where in the United States our oil comes from. It's produced in 32 states and coastal waters, and 41% in Texas. And the Energy Information Agency left off Alaska, which I'm sure belongs on here somewhere. We'll double check that. But Alaska certainly is a prominent oil producer in the United States. And finally, here's the major oil producing countries from 1980 to 2019. The United States was on a decline, and then with the advent of fracking and other technologies to produce oil from wells where oil was more difficult to get. And just remember that the reason Persian Gulf oil is so attractive, one of the main reasons is that it's easy to produce. The more difficulty, like places around the world, like Siberia, where it's difficult to get at oil, where there's a lot of it, it makes it not profitable. So the United States saw a drop off in oil production, but then a return to prominence in the oil markets, the global oil markets each day in the 2015 to 2020 era. Saudi Arabia and Russia were holding kind of steady. Saudi Arabia took a downturn in 2019 and 2020, and you can see that some of the other major oil producers in that spot there. So you know, we all are interested in the price of oil every time we go to the pump to fill up. I don't know about you, Colleen, but for me, I have not been filling up my tank much in the past month. I think once a month is about all we're needing nowadays, with oil plentiful and gasoline cheap.
Yep, I'm about in the same boat.
So that's it. And at this point, I'll remind our participants, before we get to our next topic, drop into the Q&A prompt there at the bottom of your screen, and please put some questions in, and we'll turn to those after we get through our last topic. And Colleen, you're up with our next topic, which is Afghanistan.
Great. So most of you probably recall that in late February, the U.S. and the Taliban signed an initial peace agreement, mostly settling issues of counterterrorism, withdrawal of troops. Afghan government representatives weren't participants in the talks that led up to this deal. So the deal envisioned intra-Afghan talks between the government and the Taliban set to begin in March of this year. Now here, more than halfway into May, the talks have not occurred, and that's due to a number of ongoing barriers that have made the news in the last week or so. Many of you may have seen the attack that took place on a maternity ward in Kabul last week, killing at least 15 people, and the same day, a bombing of a funeral procession that killed at least 25. Ongoing attacks and surges of violence like these continue to inflame tensions between the Afghan government and the Taliban, because even though no one has claimed responsibility for the maternity ward attack, and the Islamic State has claimed responsibility for the funeral procession bombing, many Afghan officials have still attributed these attacks to the Taliban, and President Ashraf Ghani has actually stated his intention to resume military offensives against the Taliban. But President Ghani in an ongoing political crisis resulting from this past fall's presidential election has been another factor in the stagnating talks. In February, Ghani, the incumbent, was declared the winner of the elections, but his victory has been contested by chief rival Abdullah. This continued impasse between leaders actually led Secretary Mike Pompeo to suspend $1 billion in U.S. assistance to the Afghan government. But this week, or over the weekend specifically, there's been progress on this front. Ghani and Abdullah have signed a power sharing agreement, which will have Ghani staying on as president, but both men are given an equal say in the number of ministers appointed, and Abdullah has been placed in charge of leading peace talks with the Taliban whenever those get underway. There are some substantive parts to the agreement that have caused confusion, notably around prisoner exchanges. The Trump administration blueprint set forth the release of up to 5,000 Taliban prisoners. But Ghani has expressed that Afghanistan has made no commitment to release Taliban prisoners, and this remains a sticking point for negotiators on the side of the Taliban. But obviously, COVID-19 looms over the course of the peace talks, having had its healthcare system and broader infrastructure undermined by many decades of war and crisis. It's likely that Afghanistan is uniquely vulnerable to the spread of COVID-19. USIP released an interesting commentary called Coronavirus in Afghanistan, an opportunity to build trust with the Taliban, which actually suggests that COVID could be a springboard to cooperation between the Taliban and the Afghan government. Even though the Taliban has released kind of contradictory statements about the spread of COVID within Afghanistan, they've already shown a willingness to allow humanitarian responders in to help stop the virus spread in Taliban-controlled areas. And so this commentary suggests that cooperation needs to begin first and foremost with a cessation of violence by all sides, a joint guarantee for safety and protection of humanitarian responders, and then public endorsements of social distancing measures by both the government and the Taliban.
Yeah, it's quite an interesting situation in Afghanistan, and of course, the United States is poised to reduce its presence there. An interesting picture you have here. This is, I believe it's Ambassador Zalmay Khalilzad, who was the chief U.S. negotiator with the Taliban in Doha earlier this year and last year with the Taliban leader. And I think President Trump said that he wanted to start the drawdown now, and the Pentagon wanted to, again, as you mentioned, the COVID-19 situation has compounded trying to sort through the otherwise thorny relationship between the United States and the parties. some things in world politics you just can't make up, and one of those is the fact that Afghanistan has divided leadership between two guys who have been battling each other, and one is the CEO of the country and the other is the president of the country. I'm not quite sure how that can work out, and the government divided, trying to deal with the Taliban's demands. It's just quite a mess.
Yeah, and not really having the capacity to even accurately measure the spread of the virus within country. I've seen figures around 2,300 cases, but in all likelihood, it's significantly more because Afghanistan is also experiencing an issue related to the spread of coronavirus within Iran, which I'm sure has been discussed on this previously. But a lot of Afghan returnees from Iran who have left as coronavirus has continued spreading within Iran, it seems are now bringing it back into already particularly under-resourced, even by Afghan standards, regions of the country.
Well, let's turn to topic 5. Again, a reminder, people can put their questions into the Q&A queue at the bottom of the screen. And our final topic for today is the International Criminal Court, which was in the news this week when the Department of State released a statement by Secretary of State Pompeo concerning the Palestinian issue and the International Criminal Court. And in part, Secretary of Pompeo said that the International Criminal Court is a political body, not a judicial institution. He was referring to the ICC prosecutor reaffirming her intention to exercise jurisdiction over the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza through a new filing to the court. And this involves a case where the Palestinians are being considered as a state in the view of the Rome Statute, which is the governing document for the International Criminal Court. The United States opposes that interpretation of the Palestinians as a legitimate state and has threatened to take action against the ICC. In the final sentence in his statement, Secretary Pompeo said, quote, "The United States reiterates its longstanding objection to any illegitimate ICC investigations. If the ICC continues down its current course, we will exact consequences." Well, that was not really amplified in anything that the Secretary said in terms of what those consequences would be, but the United States and the ICC have had a checkered history. And most recently in 2017, the United States objected to the ICC attempting to extend jurisdiction over U.S. forces in Afghanistan. They were looking at jurisdiction for international tribunals that might have been brought against U.S. forces in the Afghan region. So this case with Palestine is not the first case dealing with the ICC and the United States interests. And we'll just give a little background, a little context on this story. The ICC, if you're not familiar with it, it was a court that was set up in 2002 under the Rome Statute, which was approved by 20 countries back in 2002 that are parties to the ICC, and the ICC is located in the quaint little town of The Hague in the Netherlands. Just a warning, if you go there, be careful. Parking is tough. We had a chance to visit The Hague a few years ago and enjoyed seeing that quaint little Dutch town. But it is known best for the International Criminal Court and a number of other world bodies that are based there. But the 2002 Rome Statute called for the ICC to have jurisdiction where genocide, crimes against humanity, or war crimes might have been committed on or after July of 2002, when the Rome Statute was certified. and the crimes would have been committed by a state party national or in the territory of a state party or in a state that has accepted the jurisdiction of the court, or the crimes were referred to the ICC prosecutor by the UN Security Council pursuant to a resolution adopted under the UN Charter. So that's the ICC, where they get their authority and what they look at in terms of jurisdiction.
It's also probably worth noting that the United States is not a party to the ICC, having never signed on to the Rome Statute that created the court.
Okay. Colleen, anything more on any of our topics? We're going to turn to some questions here.
Yeah, on the questions.
Tracy Lehman is on with a question. If Trump withholds funds to the WHO, how is that similar or different to withholding funds to Ukraine? Well, it's probably no different in that it would be the result of an ultimatum. You know, I don't want to use the word quid pro quo, but there it is. Do this for that. We are demanding of the WHO their accountability, their stepping back from what the United States claims is their perceived favoritism towards China and manifest in the way they reported and acted upon the first indications of the Wuhan origins back in December and January of COVID-19. In the case of Ukraine, the case that was made in the impeachment of President Trump was that it was a quid pro quo, that President Trump demanded that Ukrainian authorities investigate the connections between the Biden family and certain corrupt entities in Ukraine. So again, both situations are quid pro quo. In the case of Ukraine, what was being threatened to be withheld was coming out of a military aid budget, and it was to provide certain lethal aid and munitions and so forth. So that's somewhat different than the case with the WHO. But in the case of the WHO, the $400 million from the United States goes towards funding that organization. And one thing we didn't mention is that the WHO, for a lot of countries around the world, acts as the Center for Disease Control. These countries don't have their own prominent organizations, so they rely on the WHO for advice and support in dealing with epidemics in their country, not just the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, but they rely on the WHO for those funds for medical support. Charles Bowers says that Ambassador Bowers, it's good that you're listening in. I hope you'll find that Colleen's doing a good job in your place here. Ambassador Bowers asks or comments, the United States has never joined the ICC. No U.S. president, Democrat or Republican, seems to have seen the ICC as something America wants or needs to support. And then he asks why. I think the argument that has been made in the past, and it was really hammered home by the Bush administration, is that we don't want to yield sovereignty. And in fact, the prohibition of U.S. membership in the ICC is actually a federal statute. It's not just policy, but there is a U.S. law preventing the United States government from becoming a member of the ICC, and that stems back from the Rome Statute. So the main issue of why not is that the United States doesn't want any foreign body to exercise judicial authority over individuals who are overseas or conducting something that might be construed by others as falling within the purview of the ICC. So the law is still on the books, and we will probably continue to remain away or not a participant in the ICC. Colleen, Catherine Kelly from our Tennessee World Affairs Council Education Outreach. She runs the Academic World Quest program. Catherine, thanks for joining us today. Could you comment on the current U.S. Department of State situation involving the arms sale to Saudi Arabia, as it may or may not relate to the firing of the Department Inspector General? Well, Catherine, I think you've been doing a lot of news reading today this past couple of days to be keeping up with that. I think the case involved an $8 billion sale of arms to Saudi Arabia, and to the best of my knowledge, this was a supplemental package because the Saudis had a $120 billion arms sale in the works that included major war implements, but I think the $8 billion was a supplemental sale of weapons to support Saudi operations in Yemen. They've been engaged in the civil war in Yemen for 3 years now, and have used a great many U.S. Items of war material, military hardware, munitions, and so forth. And I think that's what that package was. And the case about the firing of the Inspector General, and I think we still haven't seen all of this play out, but the Inspector General was investigating Secretary of State Mike Pompeo's release of that $8 billion package of sales, and the background was that the Congress was objecting to that sale. So it's a question of the constitutional authority between the U.S. Congress and the administration, whether the law applied in this case, how it should have been implemented, and whether the State Department complied. And the Inspector General, as IGs do throughout the government, was looking into whether that practice was consistent with the law or not. So there's more to come on that question. Campbell Lehman, a student in our World Quest program, asks, what do you think will be the outcome of Prime Minister Netanyahu's corruption trial? Colleen, I don't know if you've been following that at all, but you know, we've just seen this past week a unity government between Benjamin Netanyahu's Likud party and Benny Gantz's Blue and White party take power, with Benny Gantz being assigned the position of alternative prime minister. And Prime Minister Netanyahu, who has been in power for quite so many years, was indicted by a court in Israel for corruption charges. And I believe he was hoping to hold on to his position as prime minister so that he could avoid that prosecution. In terms of the outcome, I am not that familiar with the elements of the case, although in corruption cases where charges have been brought to indictment, and in the case of someone in a position of power, for them to be hanging on for this long, my suspicion is that that there's probably something to the allegations. Colleen, any comments on any of those things, or something more in the news that might have grabbed your attention this week?
Yeah, I mean, I think with regards to the ICC, kind of an interesting thing about the U.S. relationship with the ICC is that in the very early years, the United States was hostile not only to the influence of the ICC over the United States, but broadly towards ICC activities. And prior to the Trump administration, kind of reversing this stance on foreign policy, had become more accommodating towards, not assisting per se, but supporting ICC investigations into, for example, Dominic Ongwen, who was taken into custody for his involvement in the Lord's Resistance Army in Uganda. And so from the Bush through Obama years, there had been an evolution towards being more supportive of its work, particularly combating genocide and war crimes in sub-Saharan Africa, that the Trump administration has been more ardently rejecting of.
Yeah, and didn't we just have the arrest of a Rwandan war criminal?
Yes,
Um,
who had taken refuge, I suppose, in Paris.
yeah, Mr. Kabuga, Felician Kabuga, was arrested in Paris. He had been on the run for 25, 26 years now since the Rwandan genocide.
Yeah, the ICC has certainly been much more effective at addressing war crimes, or effective is maybe not the right, has certainly been more targeted at affecting war crimes that take place on the African continent compared to other regions.
Yeah, that's what a lot of African leaders complain about, that when it comes to the northern hemisphere, there were not quite so many corruption cases or war crimes cases. Although the Balkans War did produce a number of cases, and that would have preceded the ICC, right? The 90s. So that was a different body at The Hague. All right. I think we've had a terrific news review. Colleen, any closing comments? I will mention that we do have one comment from Ambassador Bowers. He said, "Great job, Colleen," and wants to know if you want the slot permanently.
I have to say, I think you and Ambassador Bowers have better banter, so but I'll keep learning from him.
Well, I think you did a terrific job. First time out of the box here, and we thank everybody for joining us on Colleen's debut on the news review. Please tell your friends about the news review. We're here every Tuesday at 2 p.m. Central Time. And you can also find our evening presentation on Tuesdays. Tonight it will be Global Dialogue, where Ambassador Bowers, who has probably got his feet up this afternoon, will be pressed into duty talking about the future of American diplomacy with Ambassador Marcy Rees, who is at Harvard University. She's the director of the Harvard Project on the Future of American Diplomacy, along with Professor Thomas Schwartz from Vanderbilt University. He's a professor of history there, and his emphasis is on the U.S. foreign relations. So that should be a pretty dandy conversation about the direction of American diplomacy in this age of transformation, taking a look at an institution that has served America well, and we always tip our hats to Americans in the diplomatic service who are at the edge of American influence and representation around the world. I will mention this is membership month at the World Affairs Council. We encourage everybody to become members of the World Affairs Council. That's how we can pay our Zoom bill and the other bills that we have that go along with running a nonprofit in times where nonprofits are all kind of struggling to stay afloat. So we welcome your becoming a member. You can go to tnwac.org/join and become a member of the World Affairs Council. For Colleen and I'd like to sign off and just thank everybody for coming. And we will see you next time on the Global News Review from the Tennessee World Affairs Council. Thank you.